Thus, liberation theology, black theology, feminist theology, and so on, draw on religion as a way of troubling oppressive forces in the world. So how can we approach some of the mythology that purports to explain gender and sexuality? When thinking about gender and sexuality, creation myths have been particularly important in different religious traditions and do some explanation, but also liberation. Those found in Genesis are one particular set of myths developed and elaborated in the 6th century BCE. They are part of a larger ancient Near Eastern pattern, the likes of which we see in Babylon, Assyria, Ugarit, and others. These are regionally specific in their cultural and geographical context, and there's a sense that the events depicted therein happened somewhere nearby. The Euphrates River is mentioned in the Genesis version of the origin story. Now, even if we concede that these myths are attempting to do some explanation of the origins of sexual difference, and really not everybody agrees on that, farming or why snakes don't have legs seem to be really important themes in these texts as well. So, even if we concede that gender and sexuality are part of the meaning of these texts, it's not always clear. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have interpreted the creation narratives in Genesis in confoundingly conflicting ways. To support or oppose marriage, to support or oppose celibacy, and so on. And I say that these are narratives and myths in the plural in Genesis because they are actually two creation stories. One in Genesis chapter 1 and the other in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. In the first, a deity called Elohim creates the Adam, which is a gender-neutral term for the English word human. Adam is male and female simultaneously in the image and likeness of Elohim. In the second, a deity called Yahweh Elohim creates Adam by fashioning it out of dirt and then breathing into its nostrils, and then creates animals as a failed attempt for a companion, and then finally creates woman by splitting her from the man in the Adam at the rib or the side. But we can already see that these two different versions might mean all sorts of things with respect to gender. They might imply equality, as in Genesis 1, where they are simultaneously male and female, or hierarchy between the two creatures, as in Genesis 2, where they're created one before the other. They might imply that sexual difference is an afterthought, and that a non-binary being is the prototype of humanity. They might imply that male-female complementarity is the ideal, and that a belief in male-female difference is the source of human malady. That is to say, there's no single meaning that's self-evident here. In the LDS context, the addition of the Book of Mormon, books of Abraham and Moses, or the temple drama, some of which retell these stories, only adds to the problem, because now, instead of just two, we have 4 or 5 different versions that cannot all be reconciled. Any interpretation is a selective reading that has to ignore some aspects of the stories and emphasize others. Now, I start with the creation story because it is so central to one of the myths that claims to derive from that story. And I want to deal with some of the common interpretations then of that story. The heterosexual myth makes a claim about both gender and sexuality. It claims that by divine or natural or cultural design, and there are secular versions of this myth as well, that humanity is divided into male and female, and that this binary division then implies that heterosexuality is the divine or natural or culturally superior form of sexual exchange. The origins of such a myth are relegated to a mythical time, a time outside of history, before the social, whether in prehistory, premortality, divine design, or the unconscious. The goal is the same in each case, to diminish human responsibility for creating and maintaining sexual difference as a social practice. Heterosexuality is all that there is. It's rooted in some prehistoric culture or nature or so on. Such a view supports a popular myth of heterosexual supremacy. Civilizations decline when heterosexuality is not strictly enforced according to this myth. That's because in this myth, heterosexuality is culture. Therefore, non-heterosexuality is chaos. As the story goes, in more sophisticated secular versions, in a primordial past, labor was divided between two groups. One hunted and one gathered. One produced and one reproduced. One protected and one nurtured. Or we look to the brain or the body as the root of our social divisions. Anything else is preferable to taking responsibility for the systems we've created, systems which have crushed and continue to crush so many of the teeth of its spheres. But this myth has a central problem. Where did non-heterosexuality come from? Now, I want to suggest there's something a little bit more damning about this secular myth of heterosexuality, besides its explanatory failures. That is, that it's actually a new interpretation, not a timeless one. In fact, the heterosexual myth is an attempt to soften the earlier form, the patriarchal myth. The reason is because the emphasis on male and female difference, the supposed fact that supports the heterosexual myth, was and still is the primary argument of the patriarchal myth. In the patriarchal myth, at some primordial time, whether from God or nature or culture, men and women were different, and that difference suggests that there was an inevitable hierarchy. Where there is a difference, there must be also superiority or inferiority, according to this reading. In this myth, men are naturally stronger, are suited to the world outside the home, are more rational and less emotional. It's not the case for our current president, obviously, right? Or whose bodies are less shameful. Or one could point to the Genesis narrative, where it clearly says that man shall rule over the woman. The patriarchal reading of Genesis is also repeated in the New Testament, which says that Adam was not deceived and he was created first, evidence of an inherent male superiority. The patriarchal myth has far stronger support in the Christian and LDS tradition, in part because these are often products of patriarchal culture. So the heterosexual myth faces an interpretive problem, another interpretive problem. It actually relies on the same assumptions, texts, and narratives that the patriarchal mythology is founded on, though both pretend not to be interpretations at all, merely representations of what is obvious. The patriarchal or heterosexual myth give both an aura of inevitability or of facticity that protects against liberatory reforms. These are both regulatory myths, or regulatory interpretations of creation myths. They appeal to some original time that has supposedly fixed or settled the question and preclude change. In another example of this, I want to point out that first, heterosexual and patriarchal interpretations are not the only ones available of these texts. And second, that binary sexual difference is not theologically or biologically or socially obvious at all. Many people have interpreted these myths from non-gender binary assumptions. I'm going to give a small peek into early Christianity, my other research area, that has helped me to think a lot through these issues. This is a story about a 2nd and 3rd century Christian movement, not quite a separate group, but a movement within Christianity that had a lot to say about creation, gender, and so on. Valentinus was a teacher originally from Egypt, but who flourished in Rome, who was quite influential. He had many disciples who elaborated on his teachings, but specifically I want to point out a dispute within Valentinianism, that is, between different thinkers within this same tradition, rather than contrast Valentinians with non-Valentinians. The point is to show that their own disagreements about gender, whether sexual sameness or sexual difference is primary, give us a sense of just how complex and old this problem is. Most of the texts that we have from this movement are from the Nag Hammadi library, a bunch of Egyptian Coptic texts, but we also have a lot of descriptions of Valentinus and his school from Greek and Latin Christian authors. Why Valentinianism as a prelude here? Well, because it has a strong tradition of premortal existence and divine beings who generate offspring in the eternal realm. So it kind of sounds familiar. But it isn't the same as Mormonism for a variety of reasons, and I don't want to conflate the two. But I think that it does illustrate something that we can chew on about these mythical structures. Further, it provides an example from the early generations of Christians who are thinking deeply about gender and reproduction and what it means to ascribe sexual difference to God. They were arguing whether or not binary sexual difference is a necessary attribute of divine identity, and whether or not male-female couples are necessary for divine reproduction. Interesting, right? In one version of their premortal existence drama, the first father, Death, emits one offspring by means of the only begotten. That is, the first father and the only begotten, namely the masculine mind, is the other name for it, emit a being together. This emission takes place, quote, as part of no couple, neither male nor female. And one early Christian author explains how this is possible. Sometimes the father emits with his consort silence, female being, then again he is above male and female. In a related version of this myth, the father is described as neither male nor female. So you have a being that is called the father, a male name, but who has also transcended sexual difference. And this being can create all alone, even though he also has a female consort to create with. So much for the ideal of male and female complementarity. Such an attribute is too small for a divine being, they reason. This very structure of the divine cannot be contained by sexual difference. It has to be set aside, calling into question the ontological foundation of sexual difference. It's secondary, arbitrary, created, not eternal. In another collection, another text from this collection, the Tripartite Tractate, explains that this being does not have a partner because, quote, that would imply a limitation. God is above that. Rather, it engages in self-generation. But it goes even further. The first couple in this text is father and son. Like the first individual, neither is distinctively gendered as either male or female. Both the father and the son are described in both male and female terms. The son is called silence, that divine consort name that we met before, wisdom, grace, and so on, using female titles. This notion of sexual difference as a hindrance, a limitation, a mark of lower status, wasn't just restricted to the divine realm for many Christians, but others saw that this was the ideal for human beings as well. In this most famous passage, Paul says that after baptism, the ethnic markers of Jew and Greek, the social markers of slave and free, and the sexual markers of male and female are differences which go away. They are of no importance. It is an incredible claim about the sameness, not the difference, that unite us in Christ. Unfortunately, we haven't always lived up to this ideal, and frankly, neither did Paul. But we can see why the Valentinians, who were close readers of Paul, believed that male and female were properties which would not adequately describe God, even a procreative God. Or in Paul's case, they would not properly describe the baptized. This may have had to do with their reading of Genesis. Let me drill down briefly into one aspect of that story. Some of the oldest interpretations that we have of Genesis, and it was actually ignored for a long time, which is another story. But when we do get interpretations, they say that the original human being, the Adam, was created as an androgen, a creature which was neither or both or somehow beyond sexual difference. This Adam is a single creature, and they, as they are called, are male and female. Both Jews and Christians frequently understood Genesis 1 in this way, and then they read Genesis 2 as the moment when this male and female creature was divided. Looking at Genesis in this way, as an account of an original androgen human created in the image and likeness of an androgen God, made sense to a lot of Christians and Jews. Was the early Christian view that we've explored here an anomaly in the ancient world? Not necessarily. Being neither male nor female or both were elements that we find repeated in other ancient myths as well. Now, with the huge caveat that the record is incredibly complex on figures of ambiguous sex identity in the Greek and Roman world, I want to at least disrupt the idea that this period, or any period, was based on the male-female normative binary. It's historically false to say that gender has only recently been troubled. The notion of the androgen that we have already encountered in our discussion of Genesis, many Christians and Jews imagine the Adam in these terms, is something that we find in other texts as well. In Plato's Symposium, one of the dinner guests, Aristophanes, tells the story of the creation of human beings. They originally had 4 arms and 4 legs, and they rolled around all the time. That was the most efficient way to get around. And they were super happy. The gods didn't like this, so they decided to split the human being into 2, and separating these couples, these once 4-legged, 4-armed creatures into 2 separate ones. Some of these were now male-female couples, but some of them were male-male couples, and some of them were female-female couples. And Aristophanes argues that our happiness in this life is when we can reunite with our other half. This wasn't a crazy idea, but was culturally familiar with the representation of the divine being Hermaphroditus. In the myth, the child of Hermes and Aphrodite, Hermaphroditus, is swimming in a lake when a nymph of a spring falls in love with him, embraces him, and prays to the gods that their bodies would be united into one and never separated. This is one of several gender transformations that occurs in ancient texts along these lines, and there are multiple attestations and representations of this story. So it wasn't only Valentinians in Egypt or Rome or non-Christians, but also a widespread belief that gender was unstable in some way. According to the Gospel of Thomas, another 2nd century Christian text that was also discovered in the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and female one and the same, so that the male not be male and the female female, and when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom." Okay, that's a long, complicated text. The beginning of the Gospel of Thomas tells you that if anyone can discover the interpretation, then you'll never die. Nobody's done that yet. Okay. But the point is not only that we do have primordial and divine beings that are both male and female, neither male or female, or in transition, but also some indication that these were models of Christian piety for some kinds of Christians. One can see how this text also is an interpretation of Galatians 3:28, or maybe Genesis 1, where there is no longer male or female in Christ Jesus, or the male and female are one and the same. The list can be multiplied from all sorts of Christians. They didn't all accept this view, and this is the subject of my first book, arguing that this was not a universal belief, but it was still a widespread belief, and the ontology of sexual difference was mutable. So let's turn to the LDS tradition. The myth of heterosexuality and the patriarchal myth are familiar to us. But these two myths actually tell us something quite important. First, in my lifetime at least, we have already witnessed a major shift in LDS teachings on gender as the church has attempted to transition from the patriarchal order to the heterosexual order. This transition from one to the other has never fully been complete, but the abandonment or abrogation of certain kinds of patriarchy is clear. We once had a strong patriarchal tradition, once and certainly still, but I think that it's fair to say that it's been modified. With respect to the patriarchal rule, one famous example of this is BYU religious education professor Rodney Turner, who wrote a book called Woman and the Priesthood in the 1970s. Now, it's not what you think it's going to be. Well, maybe it is exactly what you think it's going to be. Okay. It's a response to the feminist movement that was calling for egalitarian marriages. He offered several examples to justify the hierarchy of husband over wife. Quote, "The true order of marriage is patriarchal in design. The husband leads because he is the living embodiment of that priesthood which governs all things." Continuing, he explained, "There is no more reason for a woman in Israel to chafe under this commandment than it is for a child to resist the guidance of loving parents. The duty of the woman to submit was part of her social position," he wrote. "As long as a woman is under her father's roof, she owes him her chief loyalty. When she marries, that loyalty passes to her husband." The comparison of the woman to the child undergirded Turner's belief that there was a natural order to patriarchy. A woman's humility in submitting, even to a husband who was, quote, less gifted or less knowledgeable, was a virtue. In another analogy, he explained that the father's, quote, position in the home is similar to that of a bishop over a ward, a president over a stake, the prophet over the church, or God over the universe. In this interpretation, the woman is infantilized and the husband is put in the position of God over her. Church leaders, too, once upon a time quoted the Genesis rule-over passages in the strongest terms. These ideas eventually grew out of fashion, but getting around the scriptural justification for them was different. That's what the text says. Then Spencer W. Kimball said that rule over just means to preside. He saw a difference in these terms. I'm not totally clear what the difference is, but he saw a difference between these terms. But the justification that he gave was efforts to soften this interpretation, and in the worst forms to erase the forms of patriarchy and marriage that were the ugliest forms. Now, you'll see some of these strong versions of marriage still, but I submit that they are more muted. And what came to replace the old patriarchal myth was the heterosexual myth, that male and female could be together, either as companions or in hierarchy, but it could accompany them both. This is a new invention, and one that earlier LDS authorities would have rejected in the strongest terms. They believed that sexual difference was hierarchical, not complementary and egalitarian. Still, despite its newness, the heterosexual myth was successful to almost invisibly replace the patriarchal myth. The heterosexual myth is capacious enough to accommodate different understandings of the relationship between men and women, both that men can preside and also that men and women are equal partners. This is one of the liberatory shortcomings of the heterosexual myth, even though it does soften some forms of patriarchy. It does not on its own present a challenge to patriarchy, but often makes room for it. So we've seen myths come and go. This isn't the only example of recent changes either. For instance, the myths about racial origins and lineages was once considered essential to Mormonism, but no longer. What other possibilities could we imagine? What other myths about gender could we draw on that would expand our constrained imaginations? We've seen that the Christian tradition itself is not unified on the patriarchal or heterosexual myth. It already has its forms and challenges to the gender binary that we often take to be immutable. But Mormonism requires its own distinct reading. What LDS thought needs is not general Christian theology that can accommodate same-sex relationships. That turned out to be not all that hard for many Christians. One just needs to read the Bible differently or contextualize its teachings about same-sex relationships as a historical relic and so on. But LDS thought starts with a different set of foundational principles, a different understanding of the nature of human relationships, and a different understanding of the nature of God. So all of this got me wondering, is the LDS tradition so unified? Is the notion of an eternal gender or singular view of heterosexual superiority the only way of thinking about things? In short, I think the answer is no. And I think that there are two places that we can look. First is historical understandings of sexual difference in the LDS tradition, and second is historical understandings of kinship in the LDS tradition. I'm leaving aside sexuality for now. There's a lot that could be said about changing LDS understandings of sexuality, from birth control to the ethics of pleasure. But I would like to contend that sexuality as a category is not really what's at stake here, and it's a bit of a head fake. Relationships and real relationships are not about sex. That may be one dimension, one really important dimension, but relationships are about kinship, about mutual obligation, care, love, intimacy, trust, and so on. So if we're reducing relationships to being only about sex and looking for a precedent there, I think that we're going to misunderstand the precedents and misunderstand what's really at stake. So let's start with sexual difference in the LDS tradition. Just a side note, I've always been fascinated by premortal fashion. Who does the hair? Are human beings essentially and eternally gendered, or is sexual difference a minor trait like hair color which may change over the course of one's life or eternal existence? I've found numerous examples in LDS teachings about the nature of sexual difference, some of which emphasize fluidity and some fixity. So for instance, in one version of the LDS premortal mythology, humans go through a two-stage creation. First, we all exist as intelligences, which are not in the shape or form of human beings. Then God organizes these intelligences until we become spirits.
what the Lord has revealed regarding the kingdoms into which evidently the vast majority of mankind is likely to go. Joseph Fielding Smith wrote this in 1963. Alluding to Galatians 3:28, that there is neither male nor female in Christ, LDS President Joseph Fielding Smith argued that he wasn't a president at the time, but okay, all right, apostle at the time, okay, were largely correct in their rejection of a sexed afterlife. The idea that there would be some other sex, a neuter being that is neither man nor woman, as the norm for the vast majority of those in the afterlife, made binary gender the exception for resurrected beings, not the rule. Smith had thought through this issue before and taught it consistently throughout his ministry. In his 1954 book, Doctrines of Salvation, he made a similar statement about sexual difference as a privilege of the afterlife. He was there responding to a question from a thoughtful person writing about a dispute they had had in their Sunday school class about whether or not it would be possible for non-celestial beings to have sex in the afterlife. Given that they weren't celestial, and then they weren't married anymore, wouldn't they just be having sex all the time in the celestial and terrestrial kingdoms? And Joseph Fielding Smith has a solution to this. Some of the functions of the celestial body will not appear in the terrestrial body, neither in the telestial body, and the power of procreation will be removed. I take it that men and women will, in these kingdoms, be just what the so-called Christian world expects us all to be, neither man nor woman, merely immortal beings having received the resurrection. Since the functions of non-celestial bodies do not include reproduction and sexual difference, the form of these bodies is necessarily different as well. There would be, he suggests, 3 sexes: man, woman, and immortal being, an undifferentiated human. His teaching he taught that sexual difference was contingent, a situational experience that only makes sense then if there is something besides sexual difference. So it wasn't that long ago that gender was not eternal in LDS thought. The varieties of kinship are the next place that I want to look. We see a lot of experimentation and variation that doesn't look like male-female pairs as the structure of families. Of course, we have proto-polygamy and spiritual wifery and Nauvoo.
We have practices of plural marriage. We have proxy marriage, where people would be married to dead people. Married for time only as another practice. Marriage for eternity only was another common 19th century practice, where you would marry someone not in this life, but
successively. So what principles can we draw from this diversity besides the existence of the diversity of kinship itself? First, I think that we can say that reproduction is not an essential feature of ritual kinship as practiced by Latter-day Saints. Whether non-reproductive relationships, proxy relationships, or adoption, LDS kinship practices have not focused on biological ties as absolutely necessary for parents and children, nor that reproduction between partners is absolutely necessary for marriage. Second, I think that we can say that male and female sexual difference is not required for kinship. And we have many examples that we can draw on from the scripture and from Latter-day Saint traditions, such as Jehovah and Michael as co-creators, Ruth and Naomi, Peter, James, and John, perhaps, the Godhead, or other pairs or groups who function as kin and even create with one another. Third, we can even extend this by pointing out that heterosexual reproduction is not the only form imagined in the scriptures either. The creation of Adam from the dust is not a heterosexual production from heterosexual sex. Eve's birth from Adam similarly follows this, and the virgin birth of Jesus as well. There are numerous examples where either non-heterosexual sex or other forms of reproduction are possible for divine beings. So let's return to Genesis 1 and 2 and read it through a different lens. The patriarchal interpretation focused on the creation of Eve as a secondary character, as evidence of her inferiority, and then pointed to the rule over passage as confirmation. This is the regulatory reading of this myth. As folks transitioned to more complementarian interpretations, those aspects of the story were ignored, downplayed, or reread. And they started to see this as a liberatory story, one that could challenge the patriarchy in some way, although, as I mentioned, it falls short in many ways as well. But they emphasized in this reading the oneness of the couple, the unity of the couple, as eschewing any hierarchy between them. Both, however, see this story as primarily a commentary on gender. What if, instead of telling us about gender, we read this story as telling us about kinship? That is, about the obligations that might bind a couple together or to bind us together with those that we love. Might it provide us with both a regulatory ideal about kinship while also being liberatory with respect to gender? So recognizing that the reason that they cling together is because they are the same is useful because it is the same obligation that male kin have toward one another in other texts. And we can set aside the covenants that Ruth and Naomi make together as well. This intimate recognition is gender neutral and also decenters sex as the defining feature of their relationship. We know this because it seems to be a common phrase recognizing kinship. King David's rebellious son Absalom tried to lead a coup against David, declaring himself king. Both Israel in the north and Judah in the south accepted Absalom's usurpation. But after Absalom dies, somewhat strangely by getting caught in a tree in a battle, David attempts to reclaim his kingdom by appealing to the tribes that had abandoned him with these verses. King David said sent his message to the priests of Zadok and Abiathar, "Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house? The talk of all Israel has come to the king. You are my kin, you are my bone and my flesh. And why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh?" Here, the recognition in both Genesis 2 and in 2 Samuel of being bone and flesh suggests to us that when the man saw the woman, after she was taken from his side, that they were kin. But he uses the language that men could give to one another as well, and presumably women. It is the same language of recognition and obligation, not of some ontological difference between male and female that binds them here. So a lot of my scholarship has been to look for gender trouble, and I'm not making that up. It's already there, I think, both in the LDS tradition and in early Christianity. Rather than reinforce an ideology or a mythology about some kinds of natural or normal sexual or gender dynamics, I'm curious about the places where those fall apart, or when and why we have seen boundaries and differences emphasized, and when and why we have seen them relaxed. What really defines the questions that I want to raise tonight is the relationship between gender and religion. On the one hand, I've tried to demonstrate repeatedly, as many others have, that gender ideas in any religious tradition draw on broader cultural ideas. There is not a purely religious view of gender, and not a single way, even in the LDS tradition, to understand gender. Rather, Latter-day Saints have already adapted to change in gender and sexual norms, and the current and past norms reflect broadly shared views of their contemporaries from their time. In particular, I've tried to show that there is a tradition not only of gender and sexual essentialism, but also of gender and sexual fluidity in the Christian and LDS traditions. This is not a single view of gender, but a plurality that is possible. The binary is not the only option. Indeed, sameness, not difference, brings humanity together in love, relationship, duty, and intimacy. To return to our local controversy with Dean Bird, who said, if it says fluidity, it says fluidity. How you interpret it is something else. Our question is how to interpret it. Interpretation being the key problem and possibility. As a reminder, I'm not expressing what LDS church doctrine is, nor am I advocating for it to change, but we have engaged in a thought exercise by bringing to bear historical and theological analysis of gender and sexuality to the common belief that church doctrine has never changed on this issue. And we have wondered whether any of the precedents based on gender and sexual fluidity might be reinterpreted, reused, or freshly applied to the contemporary situation. Similarly, we might wonder whether the changes in kinship practices and the focus on kinship instead of sexuality might provide some resources to resolve the ethical challenges that we face. I don't know what direction the church will go, but I have seen how it can reinvent itself. And my prayer is that divine justice, fairness, and love will be our guide. In faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these being love, let us be of one heart and one mind with those to whom we are bonded. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor, for that very thought-provoking lecture. We have a few questions, and I'm assuming more are going to come in, but I'm going to have to start out by just asking you to maybe help us to think through kind of the tension that you articulated. So we have gender trouble versus eternal and unchanging. And we have recent articulations of notions that truth is truth, these things don't change. I'm a historian, so obviously intellectual resonates with me. I expect change over time. That's what historians pay attention to. So what you say resonates, but what happens when this plays out in the pew, in the local congregation, right? So it's one thing to talk about it at this level, but another thing to talk about it in the pew. How do we live with, sort of notions that, hey, my goodness, things have changed a lot, right? Versus being preached from the pulpit that it's eternal and unchanging and it's never changed. Even if we talk about polygamy, right, it's still eternal and unchanging and it's never changed. How do we grapple with that paradox?
Okay, this is the part I was most nervous about. Okay. We're incredibly good about telling ourselves the story that we never change, even while we're changing all the time, right? And it's very much a part of our identity, I think, as Latter-day Saints to sort of see an unbroken chain of continuity despite all the changes. But at the same time, we also celebrate change as well because we believe in continuing revelation. We have all these other tools to kind of help us make sense of change. And we often look to the past to help us to understand what changes we might make as well. And this happens in all sorts of ways. You know, your research on race has done a lot of this work as well, as how modern Latter-day Saints looked to the past to find precedents to change the policies that had been around for a long time. And so it might be that some of the work that historians can do is to trouble this narrative that we tell ourselves that it's never changed by showing the ways that it's changed. So in part, I think that the work of historians is to tell that more complicated story so that people have that as a resource for them. How that plays out in congregations and in your Sunday school class, I don't know. I'm not an expert on that myself, I haven't taught gospel doctrine in a couple of years. So, but I think that at least providing the intellectual resources for people so that they know that the story is a little bit more complex is a first step.
Okay. We have a question from the audience. And let's see. Now they're coming in really quickly. How would you respond to the biblical literalists among Latter-day Saints who reject labeling Genesis 1 and 2 as a myth, let alone a myth with very textual interpretation? So you obviously gave us the myth interpretation, but we also practice amongst people who don't read those texts in the same way. So how do you respond there?
Well, I think that I don't mean for there to be a dispute between people who take it as myth and people who take it as literal. I think that reading it literally gives you a different story by taking it very seriously. And so I'm trying to provide a very serious reading of this text. I mean, I think that the category of myth is useful for destabilizing it in some way and seeing the ways that the different interpretations have also evolved over time with respect to these texts. But people who take the text very seriously and who take the story very seriously, I think reading the text closely and showing the ways in which they don't always line up or the conflicts between the different versions that we have is also a way of destabilizing the text. Also, for Latter-day Saints, we have a long tradition of questioning the authority of the Bible and saying that it's not the last word on things as well. So I think that we have a lot of built-in aspects to our tradition. Again, besides just reading the two stories in Genesis 1 and 2 side by side and showing their inconsistencies, read them along the other versions that we have as well and show the inconsistencies there to say that, look, we've been playing with these texts and playing with this story for a long time, and that there are resources in here to tell all kinds of different versions of the relationship between males and females.
Okay. Do you see gender fluidity in historical and contemporary adoption theology and sealing?
Good question. Okay. I, once upon a time, really got into adoption theology, but that was like 8 years ago, and I think I forgot most of it now. Okay. But there were a lot of adoptions between adults where they were taking on these relationships. So it wasn't about, making dinner and tucking somebody in bed at night and those kinds of things. Like these adoptions between adult males were about forming kinship relationships. So they're not sexual relationships, at least not that we know of, right? There may have been in some cases that we don't know of that don't survive the historical record, but they certainly didn't authorize that. But I do think that if not gender and sexual fluidity, forms of kinship that can bond people together of the same sex is an option that we can look to in adoption theology as a precedent. So.
Next question: to what extent do you regard the 1995 Proclamation on the Family as regulatory myth?
Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely in that category. I think that's the work that it's trying to do. And again, regulatory myths are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. There are a lot of things that I hope that are regulated in good ways and that we can preserve some aspects of the status quo as well. So I don't think that it's necessarily wrong in that way. But I think that a close reading of the Proclamation on the Family shows pretty clearly that it's an interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 as well. It's referencing Adam and Eve. It's referencing the commandment to multiply and replenish. It's a reading. It's an interpretation of that Genesis story in the heterosexual myth paradigm. So yeah, very much so.
Okay. So a question about the broader American...
These are really fast questions here. Okay, all right. Already tired, okay.
We're just getting started.
How much longer have we got? All right.
Could you say something about the broader American culture? So bigger context, in what ways were modern Mormon struggles with gender essentialism congruent with contemporary evangelicalism, and in what ways were they unique?
Yeah. I think that in a very broad sense, Latter-day Saints are tracking almost identically with the developments that are happening in a more conservative American fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity. And the research that I've done that's coming out in my book this spring shows that over and over again, these very close relationships that are happening side by side. On the other hand, I think that it's a little bit of a mistake to suggest that they're just copying them or that there's not some organically Mormon stuff that's coming out of that, because they are appealing in ways that that evangelicals are not, to things like the pre-existence, to things like the tradition of Heavenly Mother, and so on. So there are uniquely Mormon aspects to that. But I think that there's something sociologically going on for Latter-day Saints as to why they're tracking closely with evangelicals, and even why we as Latter-day Saints are using some of the most radical aspects of our theology, about a Heavenly Mother, for example, to reaffirm traditional gender categories. And that's in part because during that time period, we're also trying to assimilate into American culture. And so we are trying to, in some ways, take and preserve our distinctive Latter-day Saint traditions and teachings, but make them palatable and reinforcing the kinds of gender norms that were expected in broader American culture, at least among evangelicals and others that we were trying to assimilate with. So I think that might explain a little bit of the ways that why Latter-day Saints are both tracking closely with other conservative Christians who are thinking about sexual fluidity in ways that are affirming things like reparative therapy, but also thinking about trying to maintain gender norms through claims of an eternal and unchanging gender, right? So I think that we're sort of drawing on unique Latter-day Saint vocabulary and themes to make the same case that evangelicals are doing during that same time period.
So maybe a question that goes along the same lines, but this question is, what are some new directions for research on this subject? And that's the content of the question, but I'm interested in both in the LDS context as well as a broader American religious context. Can you tell us what's going on in the broader field as well as in the Mormon context?
Yeah. Let's see. I think that there are so many stories that need to be told, and in part the things that we don't know yet still need to be told. So one of them is that we don't have access to a lot of records of modern Mormon church leaders that could give us more insight into the contemporary scene, right? So so that's something that I guess I would like to see more of, but that we just don't have at this particular point. But I also think that the stories of gay and lesbian organizations, their histories, like Mormon Building Bridges, telling that story and telling the story of everyday Mormons who are doing this kind of activism, is a huge research area that I think would have a lot to do for us. And I also think that there are periods that we don't know that much about. So everybody talks about this one study of Mildred Berryman in the 1920s and 30s, I think, where she works with one of the gay and lesbian clubs in Salt Lake City, and she interviews over 20 years a number of gay and lesbian Mormons. And everybody just sort of goes back to that one story. It's like, what else was happening in the 20s and 30s besides that story? So I think there's a lot in the early 20th century that we don't know that much about, too. I start my research for the book that I'm working on, or that I've recently finished, in 1945. So pretty much everything before that still needs to be researched, I think, a little bit more. But I had to start somewhere.
Yeah, the early 20th century is very much understudied in a variety of ways in the Latter-day Saint tradition. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Can you speak to the LDS Church's heavy emphasis on ongoing revelation over biblical scholarship? Does this muddy the waters on the topic of LGBTQ doctrines?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a resource in some ways for us. And the same, I'm optimistic about this, but I think that the ways that Latter-day Saints have been able to relativize biblical authority in the past, in ways that are often advantageous to the changes that we want to make, is something that we have as a potential tool in our toolbox. I was going to mix a metaphor there. Okay, arrow in our quiver, tool in our toolbox. Okay, so I think that there is potentially some potential. Now, again, I don't know, and I don't advocate what direction the church should go. That's a calling that's far above my responsibilities. But I think that there is some possibility, if that was the direction that people wanted to go in, that being able to relativize biblical authority. Now, I think that being able to relativize biblical authority on the ways that same-sex relationships are talked about in the Bible has already been really well done by biblical scholars. And so I think it would be nice to draw on some of that research in their in our collectively as a community in our ways of thinking about this, because we do kind of fall back on some fundamentalist and evangelical misreadings of what the texts actually do say about same-sex relationships, and I think that would be one other place where we could go. Yeah. It's really bright out there, so I keep looking over here. Hopefully you're,
How would you describe the spiritual home for LGBTQ saints? And I'm reading this as currently, but because I'm a historian, I'm interested in your assessment of change over time and for that question as well.
Yeah. So say it one more time.
So how would you describe the spiritual home for LGBTQ saints?
I think that the people who are more closely involved in those homes need to tell those stories more than myself. I don't live in one, so I don't know. But from what I hear from people, at least, that there are both signs of hope in some places, people who are able to find a way and a path forward, and others who simply don't. And I think that we need to hear all of those stories collectively. But yeah, I'm not the one to tell those, so I'll let the people whose stories they are tell them.
So we have a bit of comic relief, Taylor. Someone wants to know if we both shop at the same awesome shoe store.
And suit store, apparently, too.
But
yeah.
I'm pretty sure I won the sock game tonight.
Yeah. I give up on that one, yeah.
Do you feel that the way the church is set up as a gerontocracy affects our theology, i.e. having men in charge who are loyal to traditions of patriarchy, heterosexuality, and binary gender? So a lot of your conversation today, right, might resonate with this crowd, but what about the leadership, right? How does that reflect what's going on there?
Well, not all of them always have, so I don't know if it's inherently disadvantageous, because you've got Joseph Fielding Smith making pretty strong arguments for gender fluidity, right? So I think that there are. I don't know if it's an inherent limitation, because we also see we get someone like President Nelson come in and make tons of changes all at once, right? So it's certainly possible that changes might be made regardless of their source, right? But on the other hand, it is certainly true that the weight of tradition that I think that many in those roles feel, and the obligation that they feel to maintain some continuity and to maintain respect for their predecessors, does have some conservative constraints on the changes that they're willing to make. Now, there's some benefit to going slowly and thinking carefully and critically and not being blown about by every wind of doctrine or whatever that is, right? So there are some reasons why we might not expect rapid change all the time as necessarily being good in and of itself either. And taking a slow approach might have some benefits. Whether or not it's too slow or too fast is somebody else's judgment than mine as a historian. But I do think that there are both pros and cons to that system, certainly.
So I'm going to follow up that question. So, Joseph Fielding Smith, would he accept or even recognize the label of what he described as gender fluidity, right? So if we could imagine him being here with us, would he say, hey, that's not what I was doing, yeah. Right?
I'm going to say no, he would totally agree with everything I said. No, it certainly is. So, I mean, the question is an important one, because it does get to the heart of the issue of labels that I'm using here. And in part, that's because even the very word gender didn't mean in Joseph Fielding Smith's time what it means to us today. This distinction between sex and gender is really started in anthropology in the 1950s and 1960s, and really kind of spread to popular culture through the feminist movement in the 1970s. So in a way, like, our distinction between sex and gender is not quite fully one that he would recognize. To put it in his own terms, he would say that there are people who are neither male nor female, and that's where most people are going to end up. Is it fair to call that gender fluidity or not? I think it's fair enough, at least, to what his vision is. Does he see that as a good thing? No, right? And so I want to be clear that most Latter-day Saint church leaders, as I think I've tried to say, they were not fans of gender fluidity as an ideal necessarily, but they believed in it as the very structure of the relationship between males and females as being fluid. And they were trying to often guard against changes by saying men should look a certain way and women should look a certain way, and if you get your hair cut too short or too long, then you're going to, get gender confused. So they definitely worried about at least what I'm calling an ontological fluidity between male and female, and I think that they would recognize that as accurately describing what they're doing.
So I have to tell you another follow-up to that, because as you were describing the notion, right, only those in the celestial kingdom procreate, and there might be this third kind of thing. So it brought back my priest quorum advisor growing up, and I still have this memorized because I heard it so frequently. It was the regulatory myth is what you're calling it, right, of the law of chastity, right? If you abuse it here, you'll lose it there. You will be sexless and single for eternity with a smooth crotch. I have it memorized. I heard that so much. So save me from that, Taylor.
All right. So speaking of research areas, I think Mormonism and the castration complex is a huge thing that we need to look at, because it wasn't only you, it was generations of people. I mean, those were canonical books in many ways, and the teachings that he put forward were taken very seriously all the way up through our childhood, at least. So yeah, but you're right. I think that there is a threat of castration there that freaks people out, and that's definitely worth thinking a lot about how contemporary Mormon sexuality was formed by these regulatory myths. Yeah.
So this is really therapy for me. You guys, you guys get to witness. So you suggested a relationship between the church's fight against same-sex marriage to the church's fight to preserve patriarchal marital relationships. Do you see a relationship between the church's ban on same-sex marriages and black marriage in the temple, i.e. blacks being banned from the priesthood and subsequently temple marriage?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in fact, one of the ways that I think that the racial ban has often been misunderstood is as a ban on race, but it was really a ban on reproduction. It was an attempt, well, not only and not exclusively, but it was certainly an attempt to preserve racial lineages by preventing intermarriages. And the threat of not being able to form an eternal relationship with someone who was not of your race was a big reason to socially prevent those marriages from happening as well. So absolutely, I think that thinking about the priesthood restrictions, the priesthood ban or the racial bans that existed as gendered is a really important way for understanding what was at stake for many church leaders, and why they favored segregation, why they favored this sort of racial separatism as well. So I also think that the changes are potentially a precedent, not just the change in the priesthood, but the change around interracial marriage is another interesting precedent where the formerly forbidden marriages are now permitted, right? And that's a potential resource for thinking about the possibilities of change.
So are there revelations in quotes, that directly state spirits are male or female eternally, about celestial procreation is the way we get spirits, etc.? Or do these ideas that become so set in most Mormon minds simply result from influential persons offering their opinions over time?
Yeah.
So revelation versus kind of cultural understanding.
Well, if by revelation we mean something that's in the canon, specifically that's canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants, the closest that you get is something in Doctrine and Covenants 132 about the continuation of seeds I think that there are problems with relying on that interpretation as a basis of heterosexuality for a lot of reasons. In that it's really a patriarchal text, for instance, and aspects of that we want to avoid, and even aspects of the way that it talks about reproduction it's about male progeny and women are tools in that. I think that we want to be critical of some of that. But that's the closest you get is sort of one line in D&C 132, I think it's verse 63 or 64. But other than that, the only other canonical text that we have with respect to the preexistence is D&C 93, where we have, that I'm just off the top of my head here, where we have this idea that intelligences are eternal. Right? And so we have actually these competing traditions in some respects about spirit birth and about an eternal identity that are never fully resolved, I don't think, in Mormonism. And the revelations, certainly the canonical revelations, do not definitively answer the question, which is why we have competing interpretations among so many LDS authorities about which one is the best one and which one do we rely on. And when we're telling one story, we tell one. When we tell another story, we tell the other one. And so we're kind of picking and choosing a little bit about which story of the preexistence we rely on. But the short answer, that was a long answer. The short answer is no. I don't think that there are definitive revelations that answer this question. Yeah.
So how can we deal collectively with gender trauma as caused by the institution of the church and the broader culture at large? Is dismantling the myths a first step?
Possibly. I mean, I think that dismantling goes only so far. I mean, it certainly has value, and that's one possible solution, right? I'd like to suggest, and what I'm trying to gesture at a little bit is telling new myths or retelling our stories in new ways, or finding other things that can help us to make sense of these things. So rather than just a destructive, I like to see constructive projects as well as a way of dealing with this. Whether that may be a personal preference, I don't have any empirical evidence that one is better than another necessarily, but at least the project that I've chosen to do has been tried to do more of the constructive side of things. And I hope that that's useful. I don't know if it's a solution to the trauma or if there's any solution that constructive theologians could offer to that, but maybe, hopefully.
So it seems like the patriarchal myth has made its way into theology. How do we deal with or reinterpret in terms of your focus on kinship, the silence that surrounds Heavenly Mother?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I have a lot of silence to say about that one. That was a good one. Okay. One of the so there are two ways, and I've argued this in an article before here too, that people have often pointed to Heavenly Mother as both evidence of the patriarchal myth, and her silence is support for that, right? And so people will say, well, if Heavenly Mother is clearly inferior to Heavenly Father, that's why she's silent. That's not why she's not fully a part of the Godhead, et cetera, right? And then others have attempted to retell this story in the heterosexual versions as well, to suggest that Heavenly Mother is a divine companion with Heavenly Father, that they form this idealized equal partnership between the two of them, right? And so the liberatory functions of the heterosexual version of that myth do try to push back against the patriarchal narrative about Heavenly Mother by talking about Heavenly Mother more, by having her included, right? By suggesting that she is an equal partner, using that language from the proclamation, with Heavenly Father. One of the problems or the limitations of that one that I'm trying to be sensitive to and that I've written a little bit about is that heterosexual myth then reinforces heterosexuality as well. And Heavenly Mother can be then used as evidence of the heterosexual myth in a way that can delegitimize same-sex relationships. Right? So are there other resources that we have for thinking both affirmatively about Heavenly Mother and affirming her existence, while also at the same time not necessarily reducing her purpose to reaffirming heterosexuality? And I think that's one of the sort of nuts that we need to crack a little bit more. And in part, the dearth of materials that we have, the relative dearth of materials that we have that is authoritative about Heavenly Mother, contributes to the problem on all sides, because we don't have substantial enough stories that we could complicate her account with. So I don't know. I don't know. You know, that's a problem that I think we're all still wrestling with.
So next question. To summarize, you saying that we have journeyed from patriarchal myth to heterosexual myth, and then hopefully moving into what? The archetype of kinship, or, you know, is there some hope for a movement forward?
Yeah. I think that this is a good question, because again, I don't know what direction the church is going to go, or where it should go necessarily. So I'm just trying to point to different options, different possibilities that may be available by appealing to our tradition of where we could go. But I think that there are, you know, what I've called before a post-heterosexual version of Mormonism, one which doesn't privilege heterosexual relationships but privileges relationships, is something that we can draw on all of the good that we have emphasized about kinship, about family, about connectedness, about eternal relationships, about obligations of care and commitment that we have towards one another, and stop seeing gender as the essential feature to what good relationships might look like, is one possibility, right? So certainly I think turning to kinship and away from heterosexuality would be one possible path that we could go that would, I think, draw all the best of our tradition, while also opening that up to more kinds of relationships.
So we'll do two more. We have one that's just a clarifying question. What do you mean by myth? Incorrect or just not clearly established?
Yeah, this is kind of a technical term in religious studies, even though it has a sort of popular connotation of, we mean myth by incorrect, right? And I'm trying to not use it in those terms. I'm trying to use it as a sort of broad way of thinking about the stories that we tell to explain something. Some myths might be true, some myths might not be true, but its category as a myth doesn't make it true or false necessarily, right? So I'm trying to use it in a more neutral way. This is a longer answer to the story, but I'll tell it anyway. Okay, so the Enlightenment, we'll go all the way back to the Enlightenment, okay, brings about a critique of myth as false. And there's a privileging of science, a privileging of empirical knowledge, and so on, right? I don't belong to that school of thought. I'm much more sympathetic to myth, right? I'm a believer. I'm a religious person. I find value in these stories. And so I don't see them as false science in the way that the Enlightenment thought of them. The Romantic movement tries to resurrect myth as having value, of having truth, of telling some true story. And I'm also a little bit skeptical that all myths tell some truth, too. So I'm trying to guess, I find something a little bit in between those two positions, that they're not necessarily expressions of truth and they're not necessarily expressions of falsity. They're stories that we tell to explain our world, to explain some problem that we have, to explain some condition, or to provide hope for a change as well. So that's more what I mean. Hopefully that clarifies it.
How do we negotiate within ourselves the conflicting opinion on what influential leaders of the church, past and current, decide what is church approved, not church approved? For example, Dallin H. Oaks versus Joseph F. Smith. How do we navigate sort of sometimes conflicting statements on this?
Yeah. Well, as a matter of authority, the current church leaders are the ones who define current church teachings, right? Historians can look to the past in a way to say, these are the resources that we have had and available in the past, and different options that church leaders have offered before, but as a matter of authority, the only ones that are formally authoritative are the current ones, right? That said, appealing to precedent, appealing to prior examples, and so on, are ways that Latter-day Saints of all kinds argue with each other within the halls of the church office building and within our pews and so on. We're always all negotiating and arguing and thinking through how do we weigh these different precedents. For me, what are the guidelines for how we weigh and evaluate different ones? Just because it was authoritative or it is authoritative is not, for me alone, enough to establish it as right or correct necessarily. And so I think that we have all sorts of other resources in our scriptures, in our tradition, in our ethics that we can use to weigh those competing authorities. And there isn't one way. We argue about how to weigh them as well, you know, and so, yeah, it's turtles all the way down, I guess. We're always just arguing about how to interpret it, and that's all we got. I'm okay with that.
Okay, so last question. How does the doctrine of a God with corporeality affect the constructive work such as yours? God with a body has a gender.
Yeah. So the idea of a material God is one that is, I think, really important to the Latter-day Saint tradition. On the other hand, what we mean by that, what we think a material God means, is not at all clear, right? This is a material God who can walk through walls and who can appear and disappear and so on, and do all sorts of things that the material that we think about can't do, right? Or at least I'm not a physicist, but I presume that, you know, you can't do those things, okay? So I think that the materiality actually doesn't solve this problem very much for people who want to appeal to a material God. I don't think it solves this problem. Furthermore, we have material bodies which resist the categorization as either male or female as well, and so we can just as easily point to material bodies as further precedent or ways of thinking about divine bodies that might not be easily categorized also in the binary that we impose on them, right? So I'm not sure that materiality does enough work here to solve the problem of gender in one way or the other necessarily.
So let me thank you all for coming tonight. Let me remind you that the conference picks up in the morning. We begin at 8:45 a.m. back here in this room. And please join with me in thanking Taylor Petrey.
Thank you. Thank you very much.